Oh yes, there's a button that, yeah, that's okay. Go live. And we are live now.
Shall we
And
go?
let me check the site.
Yep.
And we are live on the site as well, so you can go.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Good evening. My name is Peter Murphy. I'm the MC for tonight's Sydney Politics in the Pub. So I really want to welcome everyone who's managed to log in. First of all, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. And I warmly welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing tonight. And I realise that people are on different First Nations land all around Sydney and Australia at the moment. Because of the Sydney public health orders, Hotel Harry is shut for the lockdown, and so this is completely online tonight. If you want to put a question or make a comment for the Q&A part of the program, you have to use the chat facility in YouTube, which is what you're using now to view us. Tonight's topic is energy, moving to renewables. There is a conference of the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change coming up in Glasgow in the UK from November 1 to November 26. This is going to be some kind of showdown among states following the recent alarming reports by the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Australia is really a pariah in this situation, and our community movement for action on global warming is going to be crucial in getting Australia to play its role in the global challenge now facing humanity. The School Strike for Climate is holding a National Day of Action on October 15, that's not far away, to push us all to increase the pressure for more effective action. We have one speaker tonight to open up this topic. It is David Shoebridge, who's the Greens New South Wales Upper House member in the State Parliament. He's the Greens spokesperson for energy and forests and many other social justice portfolios. And in New South Wales, we have a particular situation where the coalition government has made some significant initiatives for action on climate change. So David will be speaking for up to 30 minutes if he wishes, and then we will move to the question and answer session through to 7:15 p.m. when we'll finish, or we'll finish when the questions and comments are exhausted. So I'd like to really welcome David Shoebridge. He's pretty well a regular on Sydney Politics in the Pub. Welcome him back, and please take the microphone, David.
Oh, thanks very much, Peter, and thanks, Kathy and the committee for the invitation to come. And I'm glad to see Politics in the Pub continuing through the lockdown. We're in a kind of virtual pub, and I've got to say, like everybody, looking forward to safely getting back to politics in an actual pub as soon as we possibly can. I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm here on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Not only am I on Gadigal land now, but the workplace that I've been elected to, the New South Wales Parliament, is also on Gadigal land. I'm also the party's spokesperson for Aboriginal justice. And we in the party, we believe that when we're talking about country, when we're making these kind of statements about acknowledgement of country, we need to do a great deal more than that. We need to take it away and ingrain it in all of the work we do in politics, in our work in workplaces, in our work in community organisations as well. Because this is and always was Aboriginal land, and we have so far to go to deliver land, treaty and self-determination to First Nations peoples. And I start with that acknowledgement. I suppose it's really kind of fascinating looking at renewable energy from a New South Wales perspective in 2021. The presentation I'm going to give to you now would have been radically different in 2019. And the thought, if someone had said to me at the beginning of 2019, well, do you know what, actually, what's happening in New South Wales could actually be a blueprint for how we could break through some of the political impasses and get national action on renewable energy and through that, national action on climate, I would have probably laughed at them. I mean, the thought that the New South Wales Parliament with, are very unreconstructed parts of the Labor Party when it comes to climate and renewables. A very, very hard right national party, keen on coal and mining, as well as the sort of fringe right that occupies such a big part of the Liberal Party, who are agitating for anything but renewables, nuclear, coal, oil, gas, anything but renewables. The thought that that political collective could have somehow given us a roadmap for a national reform, I would have said, really? But actually, that's what we got at the end of 2020. And we got there through some really hard politics, pulling together disparate voices and actually realising that there's a very rock hard self-interest, putting to one side the global interest on climate, putting to one side the environmental interest. There's a really hard self-interest in terms of jobs, economic activity, in going towards a fast, indeed an urgent move towards a 100% renewable electricity grid in New South Wales, and that's what we got. It came about through some legislation which created this electricity infrastructure roadmap. It delivered 5 renewable energy zones. Those renewable energy zones were from New England to Arana, to the Hunter and Central Coast, to the Illawarra, and also up in New England. So we have 5 renewable energy zones. Initially, there were just the 3. It was expanded to 5 through negotiations within the Parliament, and the Hunter Central Coast Renewable Energy Zone and the Illawarra Renewable Energy Zone were added after some pretty hard negotiations in which both Labor and the Greens played a major role to work with the government to expand the renewable energy roadmap. These renewable energy zones should probably be considered as kind of a modern day mixture of infrastructure, storage, and generation. And each of those renewable energy zones will have to have a mix of the core infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure to get power from the renewable energy zones into market, enough generation so that between the different renewable energy zones, we've got a guaranteed supply across the state, and enough storage in the form of batteries or pumped hydro primarily, enough storage to ensure that we have secure energy supply across the state. Now, to give you some idea about the potential for the renewable energy zones, when the New South Wales authorities went out to market to ask for expressions of interest for generation projects in the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone, the expressions of interest, and they had to be worked up, viable expressions of interest. They couldn't just be something on the back of an envelope. Received 113 registrations of interest, expressions of interest, representing some 27,000 megawatts of new energy generation and storage projects. Now, that was 9 times what is wanted and what is desirable for that renewable energy project. 9 times the amount was delivered. As I said, it was fascinating politics that got that legislation through the New South Wales Parliament. It was actually the framework legislation was brought to Parliament by Matt Keane, who was a Coalition MP. Early on, he came and spoke to my office as the Greens rep on energy and said, this is the roadmap, sketched it out in some detail and said, what's the Greens' position on this? Will you be able to support it? I said, well, I'll have to go away and have a look at it. We are interested in getting legislation through that delivers a renewable energy roadmap. We'll go away and look at it. We'll come back to you as rapidly as we can. We went away, we reviewed the material, we spoke with critical stakeholders, we spoke within the party, and we came back and said, yes, we can see this through. It's not 100% what we want. We want 100% publicly owned renewable energy. And the roadmap is ownership neutral, technically, but there's no current appetite in the state government to build the kind of infrastructure, generation or storage. And so, at least in the current term of the coalition government, the projects will be privately funded projects, but it is technically ownership neutral, the renewable energy zones. What we said is we would love there to be an element of public ownership in it. We couldn't negotiate that. We said we wanted to, but we did get the commitment that it would be ownership neutral, so that where if change happens and there's an appetite for investment in public infrastructure, the public infrastructure can feed directly into the system that we have here in New South Wales. We also said there are a number of critical things that are too important for us not to put on the table at the beginning and say have to be part of the final roadmap. One was a direct public investment in new hydrogen economy. We bounced that back and forth for a while, and we got a $50 million commitment in the legislation to invest in new green hydrogen. Now, that's hydrogen produced only by renewables, not the gas-produced hydrogen that Morrison and like wanted. And we have that, and we've actually enshrined that in the legislation, and we're seeing the initial benefits from that already. But one of the points we said was non-negotiable for us was to ensure that there would be a guaranteed place for Aboriginal economic empowerment, jobs and incomes going into all Aboriginal communities, because we're of the view that every single scrap of this renewable energy network, every single transmission line, every single storage facility, every single generator will be built on Aboriginal land. And if you go and have a look at some of the large-scale renewable energy projects that have been developed in other states, such as South Australia, you go into regional New South Wales, I've been there and I've had a look at them, and it's quite inspiring. You know, you see windmills on the horizon, huge traverses of solar panels with farms, solar farms and wind farms working together to produce a reliable power supply in South Australia. Works really well, because the wind farms tend to generate most when there's a big differential between land and air temperatures in the morning and the evening, and generate large energy in the morning and evening. And then the solar panels kick in the middle of the day when the sun's shining. Now, it works really well. It's quite inspiring, produces enough energy to export into other states. When you talk to local communities, and particularly Aboriginal communities, say, well, where's the benefit you got? They will talk about a very short-term sugar hit when the construction happened, but no ongoing return for the regional communities, or minimal ongoing return for the regional communities, and little, if any, buy-in for First Nations communities. We said we can't repeat those mistakes in New South Wales. So we got a commitment from the government enshrined in the legislation to ensure that there will be economic empowerment for First Nations peoples, and there will be guaranteed jobs and income coming from each project: infrastructure, generation and storage. And I'll deal with that in a little more detail. Eventually Labor came on board, as I said, backed in some more of those renewable energy zones, also backed in some additional work on how we can get benefit from the manufacturing that comes out of the expanded renewable energy zones. And I do give them credit for engaging usefully in that space. So did the unions. The only fly in the ointment was Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. And they had a strategy to try and delay the legislation for as long as possible in the New South Wales Upper House, with more than 300 amendments, each of which they wanted to talk to and vote on and divide on, hoping for weeks and weeks of parliamentary time to be expended on this. Their hope was that if they could apply the blowtorch on the legislation over weeks and weeks and weeks in Parliament, keep talking about coal, keep talking about how bad renewable energy was, that they could split the coalition in the course of a 2-week rugged process in Parliament. And I've got to say, all parties cooperated, all parties, apart from Pauline Hanson's One Nation, cooperated in the upper house to ensure that didn't happen. We had mammoth sittings that went through into the small hours of the evening and then resumed again after only 2 hours rest. My Greens colleagues and I were literally passing the baton, moving in and out of the chamber, trying to get some sleep. This is when Parliament used to sit. It was quite exciting. And eventually we broke the opposition to that, and the legislation passed. The legislation's in place. And if all goes well, we actually have a roadmap which will get us very close to, if not 100% renewable by 2030, which is quite remarkable given where we started. So I'm sorry for that long introduction, but the reason I tell you that is to give you a sense of hope. If you'd said in 2019, could we have got this through the New South Wales Parliament? Could we have had the Coalition, Labor and the Greens all signing on to legislation, voting through legislation and committing to it in the long term within the New South Wales Parliament? I would have thought, people would have said, well, you're kidding yourself. But there are a number of reasons why it happened. This is the only game in town for new electricity generation. No one no one, apart from the Commonwealth government, would invest in new coal-fired power stations or new gas-fired power stations. No private capital will do it. So if the coalition, with the coalition mindset, wants to build new electricity generation and storage, the only game in town, coming from their private ownership model, the only game in town was renewables. For the Greens, of course, deeply concerned about the climate, deeply concerned about jobs, wanting to position us for the future, both environmentally and economically, the only game in town was renewables. And so it kind of came together. And one of the benefits of each of the Coalition, Labor and the Greens all signing onto the legislation in New South Wales is it's a powerful signal to the market. It's a powerful signal to big investors, big pension funds, that this has longevity. This isn't going to be ripped up when the next government comes in. It's not going to be ripped up if there's a change from the coalition to Labor or minority government with Greens in power. This is a long-term plan, and it's already, as I said, we saw from the kind of interest we're seeing in that Central West Arana, expressions of interest, it's already paying benefits. So, three things I just want to run through then with that as the background. How do we ensure fair long-term returns for First Nations peoples? Remember, we're in this renewable, as we build the renewable revolution, remember every single project will be built on First Nations land. What is missing from the roadmap in New South Wales, and I'd say the biggest thing that's missing is the offshore wind industry, because the New South Wales government can only legislate out to 3 nautical miles. And most of the offshore wind assets are beyond that 3 nautical mile horizon. And indeed, there's good social reasons to build large-scale wind farms beyond 3 nautical miles and good environmental reasons to build them further offshore. That is going to require federal regulation, a federal roadmap. And I'll talk about that briefly, the potential there. And also, how do we ensure that there's actually, when we shut down the coal industry, when we shut down the big coal-fired generators, how do we make sure that no one's left behind, that there are new jobs to replace those? So, as I said in the opening, when it comes to ensuring that First Nations peoples have a seat at the table and get genuine economic returns out of this renewable energy roadmap, that was non-negotiable for the Greens. And we had been talking, indeed, in the lead up to those negotiations with the Dunghutti Lands Council on the mid-north coast, just out of Taree, if you can picture there, who are in the middle of negotiations on a $1 billion pumped hydro project. Now, some of that pumped hydro project, it comes off the Macleay River. The pumped hydro is off-stream. It's meant to only fill in flood events, and it'll be a large-scale storage that fills in flood events and is available then. It's a sealed system once it fills into flood events between 2 reservoirs, but it's a $1 billion project. Transmission, piping, building the reservoirs, $1 billion project. The Oven Mountain project, a proportion of that project will be built, is proposed to be built on land owned by the Lands Council. But of course, as I said, the entire project is on Aboriginal land. We've been talking with them about what kind of negotiations, what the roadmap meant, and the legislative changes we got in the renewable energy roadmap meant, what that meant for their negotiations, and how you would what are the parameters for returns to First Nations peoples with one of these projects. And it's my view that one of the non-negotiable elements in the return needs to be a long-term share in the income stream, not just a few traineeships when the construction's happening and a couple of people mowing the grass under the pylons. There needs to be a long-term income return. Sometimes it's called, a capped income return, but there needs to be a share of the ongoing income going back into the Lands Council, going back to traditional owners, going back into the communities. Interestingly, that the renewable energy legislation contains those kind of statutory requirements. Now technically, the Oven Mountain project is just outside the renewable energy zone, but the same negotiating principles apply. The legislation includes now, as an amendment that we moved as one of the principles in the renewable energy legislation, and I'll just read it to you, to increase employment and economic opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in New South Wales, and to promote consultation and negotiation with traditional Aboriginal owners on land on which generation, storage and network infrastructure is proposed to be constructed or operated under this Act. The legislation also provides that guidelines have to be signed off by the Minister as to how those negotiations will occur and how the benefits will actually be signed off for First Nations peoples. And there's a consultant in the field now, a First Nations consultant in the field now, working with key stakeholders to get those guidelines in place. Now, with the experience that we'd had talking with the Dunghutti people, that's why we put those legislative requirements into the roadmap. And now the Dunghutti people can look to those legislative requirements and hopefully the guidelines in due course and finalise their negotiations on the Oven Mountain project. Of course, there's lots of other considerations for First Nations peoples with these projects, and there's no guarantee that the Dunghutti people will agree to the Oven Mountain project. They may find the environmental cost of building the reservoirs and the pipelines and the transmission lines too high. It may be that it's proposed in inappropriate, culturally sensitive land. Those are matters that need to be part of the negotiation from the very outset, and that's still a fair way to go with Dunghutti people. So what does best practice look like when it comes to legislating, when it comes to giving a return to First Nations peoples with these large-scale renewable energy projects? And remember, just in New South Wales, the estimate is something like $30 billion worth of new infrastructure being built. And out of that $30 billion of infrastructure, there will be hundreds of billions of dollars of income generated over the next decades. That's the scale of the projects. That's the scale of the income we're talking about. And that's where the opportunity, such a strong opportunity, lies for First Nations peoples. Well, there's a difference between compensation and benefits, of course. Now, we've been working with the New South Wales Parliamentary Library looking at best practice around the rest of the world. You can look to actually a number of the negotiations that have been struck in Canada with First Nations peoples in Canada on some big infrastructure projects over there. And there's a difference between compensation and benefits. If First Nations land is going to be used for infrastructure, if it's going to be damaged by the construction, or it's going to be alienated by the construction and the infrastructure, well, there needs to be direct compensation for that physical interference with land at fair market value, indeed probably at slightly above fair market value to deal with that. But then we also need the second part, and it's the second part that's most critical. And for me, that'll be the litmus test of whether or not we've learnt from the South Australian example and from international best practice. The second part is not compensation for the taking of the land or the impairment of land, but it's actually the benefits, sharing the wealth of the resources that are being extracted. And that's an ongoing share in the income stream going to First Nations peoples. How that's shared, whether it goes into a trust structure that works across lands councils and traditional owners, is a very complicated discussion. That's why the guidelines are in negotiation, and there will almost certainly be different solutions for different First Nations groups around the state. That's the exciting prospect, and it's also the challenge. If I could then move to offshore wind. As I said, the renewable energy roadmap for New South Wales, because of the jurisdictional limits of any state parliament, can only go to 3 nautical miles offshore. It's about 5 k's, 3 nautical miles. I'm not great on nautical miles, but I'm told it's about 5 k's. So the renewable energy zones can extend to 5 kilometres offshore. But most big, large-scale offshore wind projects will be well beyond 5 k's. They'll be within 100 k's of the shore, still on the continental shelf, but well away from the actual coast. There's a bunch of reasons for that. Better wind assets out there, less impact with marine speed, with bird life in particular, further no visual pollution to the coast. There's a number of reasons why most of the projects are significantly more than 5 nautical miles offshore. All pretty much within 100 nautical miles offshore because you want to service them, and you also want to make sure you don't drop off the continental shelf because you really can't build it beyond there. But the New South Wales government has acknowledged there's immense potential for offshore wind. And we've seen a discussion paper produced by the federal government saying something about offshore wind. They don't seem to be deeply hostile to offshore wind, is the current position of the federal government, but nowhere near producing a regulatory framework that will actually encourage it and more important than that in some ways, link it in to the renewable energy infrastructure and legislation that the state government has built. Throughout that entire negotiation in 2020, getting the roadmap through in New South Wales, there was a real divide, a real political divide between the state on one hand and the federal government on the other. And the federal government is still not at the table, still not at the party. So the state can extend renewable energy zones out to 5 nautical miles. That'll be of some benefit, but it won't actually do the job. We know that there are enormous opportunities for offshore wind off the coast of New South Wales. And if you think about the coastal zone from just south of Wollongong, 50 k's just south of Wollongong, to just 50 k's north of Newcastle, that's the zone that also has the bulk of the energy needs, the population that has the bulk of the energy needs, and also in Newcastle and Wollongong has the bulk of our manufacturing capacity readily available. Within that zone, more than the estimates that have been done, and I credit both the MUA, the Maritime Union of Australia, as well as the research from Blue Economy, and they to provide some of this data. That zone can produce more than 2,000 gigawatts of power, an extraordinary amount of power, a multiple of the actual current energy use that we have within that entire within the entire New South Wales market, a multiple. That's the kind of scale of offshore wind potential we have in that area. But to make it happen, we need a regulatory regime. There's been an offshore wind project off Victoria, basically ready to go, with funding ready to go. But the reason it hasn't been able to get off the ground is because there's no regulatory framework from the Commonwealth Government to see it happen. Now, there's bloody good wind assets, it might surprise you to know, in the Bass Strait and other parts. Also quite close to Melbourne, also quite close to manufacturing and energy demand, but there's no regulatory framework federally to make it. If we do get that regulatory framework, well, that the scale of the offshore wind assets that we have could really make us an international energy superpower. You link that to our onshore solar and wind assets, and there's an extraordinary potential for Australia. That would require strategic investment. And why is it that it's so exciting that wind real estate, if you like, is off the coast of Newcastle and Wollongong? Well, it's because a lot of the skills that are currently used in the engineering skills in the mining space, the skills that are available with those two large ports and the workplaces that are attached to those ports and the industrial workplaces that are attached to those ports, that's the workforce we need to build, maintain and operate the very large offshore wind facilities that will be needed to make the offshore wind potential. Boat building, shipbuilding skills to produce the large rigs, engineering skills to actually design, maintain and construct the engineering rigs, electricity workers that were otherwise being displaced from the coal-fired power stations needed to maintain and run the offshore wind facilities, and then also to take advantage of this surge of cheap, almost endless, cheap, reliable renewable energy, which can build a manufacturing renaissance in both Newcastle and Wollongong. We have the workforces, we have the potential, and through Newcastle and Wollongong, we can then feed the energy back into Sydney through very, very well-established existing infrastructure hubs. The last thing I'll talk about is ensuring that regional economies are brought with us, and we don't have these hollowed out former fossil fuel economies, particularly in the Illawarra, but also in the Central Coast and the Hunter in particular. Now, there's a number of issues we could talk about that. The Australian Greens will be launching within, this might surprise you, we have a federal election coming on board. We'll be launching some additional policies in that space to talk about how we have the funding and we have the local buy-in so that we have new green jobs guaranteed and that we ensure the current workforce that they won't be hung out to dry. Now, we know this has been able to be done in other parts of the world. The entire German coal industry was first nationalised and then shut down, and every single coal employee was given a guaranteed job and a guaranteed income by the German government to assist in that transition. Not just assist, so they could thrive and do well in the transition. And that's a perfect role model for what we should be looking at as we move out, shut down. We need to urgently shut down the coal industry, but protect those workers using the German model. Can I deal with just one last thing in terms of ensuring that regional communities also get a fair share, apart from First Nations communities, get a fair share from this infrastructure? At the moment, there is a battle, a totally unnecessarily battle happening in regional communities between environmentalists on the one hand, people who love national parks and state forests on the one hand, and rural landowners on the other. And that is because the way in which landowners are compensated when large-scale transmission infrastructure is built through their land is woefully inadequate. They get a one-off small payment for having transmission lines run through their land, pylons built on their land, having to give a right-of-way and guaranteed access to sometimes very, very unfriendly, now privately owned transmission operators like Ausbury and Energy Australia. And they get a one-off small payment of the tens of thousands of dollars for this major interference with their land, for the loss of land value that they'll have, and it's woefully inadequate. So landowners, when new infrastructure projects, new transmission lines are being proposed, and the most controversial one is the Hume Link now, which is required to get Snowy 2.0 on board, are desperately trying to prevent that infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure being built on their land. Meanwhile, those same landowners are desperately keen for the generation infrastructure to be on their land, because the return that landowners can negotiate for having solar panels or wind farms put on their land can be in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So for landowners, it's enormously beneficial to get 5 or 10 windmills put on your land, a small wind farm put on your land. That could net you $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. But if you have a transmission line cut right through the middle of your property, you might get $30,000 or $50,000 for the entire compensation for the life of the project. And what that has meant is landowners have been pushing the authorities to not build those transmission infrastructures through their land, but instead push it into national park, push it into state forest, which causes a huge amount of environmental damage. That's the kind of push and pull that's happening right now in regional New South Wales. It's the kind of push and pull that's happening right now in regional Victoria. And we need to resolve that urgently if we're going to ensure that we get the kind of environmental and social benefits out. The way we do that is we ensure that there is a fair return to landowners for the transmission infrastructure, a fair annual return given to landowners for that infrastructure, to encourage the infrastructure to go, first of all, where it's going to be the cheapest to build, because that's almost certainly where it's cheapest to build. Secondly, to ensure that it doesn't cause huge amounts of environmental damage in state forests and national parks. And thirdly, so that those regional communities that are providing the land get a fair return. Just like First Nations peoples need a fair return, the landowners and the communities on which this land is being built deserve a fair return as well. So I'm sorry that's been a little long. You can see that when you start unpacking energy policy, there are so many layers and layers and layers of it. But what I'd say is this finally, we did it in New South Wales. We broke the political impasse. But if we're going to get to anything like what we need for net zero before 2050, and let's be clear, Australia has an obligation to get there before 2050, we need that kind of legislation to have a national underpinning. We need to ensure what's happening in New South Wales is linked up to what's happening in South Australia and what's happening in Victoria. We actually need critical Commonwealth investment in some of that new infrastructure build. And we need a regulatory roadmap for offshore wind to link with what's happening onshore to really get the potential for renewable energy going forward. All of that is going to require a new government, a new Commonwealth government. I would say a new Commonwealth government with Greens in the balance of power so we can negotiate the outcomes for people on the planet.
Wow, thank you very much, David. You kept your 30 minutes. Pretty good. And as you say, there's so much in there. So I just think on behalf of the audience to express a real appreciation to you for that effort. And we'll go now to the question and answer. And I'll just say to people, if you're on the YouTube, just type your questions or your comments into the chat. So there's a first question is, are there other state parties also likely to be campaigning on a renewables policy? And if so, do the Greens have confidence that they have the level of expertise required to administer such a transition? And that is in the regions that you spoke of, these special.
Yeah. Well, as I said, there's now hopefully a political consensus on these renewable energy zones and on the roadmap. The national parties, I think, would still love to see a bunch of nuclear power generators thrown out. That is just never going to happen. That's one of the good things. No one will ever build one. And so even the National Party are realising if they want investment in regional New South Wales, the only game in town is renewables, the storage, the pumped hydro. So it's more a real politic from the National Party. You know, if it happens to benefit the planet, they're probably still a bit cranky about that it benefits the planet. But they realise, I think, even the bulk of the Nationals, that this is the only way you get the kind of investment in new electricity infrastructure. Meanwhile, of course, though, they're desperately keen to expand coal mines and expand the export of coal mines and do everything they can to destroy the planet in that way. But I think it's more real politic rather than a kind of ideological revolution on their behalf.
Okay, that takes me to the next point. You spoke a bit about what happens to the power station workers. And the first question that comes to my mind is 100% renewables in New South Wales by 2030. Does that mean that all of the coal-fired power stations are shut down by 2030?
Well, indeed it does. Many of them are being held together with sort of fencing wire and sticky tape at the moment, well beyond their initial designed useful life. And as renewable energy increasingly comes onto the market, and it's going to increasingly come on between now and 2030, the cost of running coal-fired power stations, the cost of coal, the huge labour involved in digging up the coal and maintaining really ageing generator infrastructure is going to become increasingly unsustainable. Which is why there is a desperate urgency to get the regulatory model in place to start building the offshore wind industry in particular, because that is a huge take-up for the very same skills that are used at the moment in the coal-fired power industry. You add to that the kind of the cheap energy that will flow into hopefully a renewed manufacturing sector, and that also will require national and state investment. They're the job opportunities for those workers. They're the very skilled workforce we need to build this new renewable grid, but especially the kind of scale that would be required for an expanded offshore wind industry. That can't wait. The regulatory model for an expanded offshore wind industry can't wait another 3 or 4 years, because then there won't be the investment pipeline in place to give those workers that job.
Thank you. The next question is from Adriana Navarro. She's asking what actions can be taken to secure the support of the trade unions and other worker organisations for renewables and the phasing out of coal. So it's related to that last answer. But
well, you know, there's a complicated relationship with the mining division of the CFMEU in this regard. So I'll say that's complicated, that relationship. I think that's a union that needs to see if there is a job guarantee in place, they need to see it's real. And that's part of the obligation to ensure we have a real job guarantee for people moving out of the industry. And that's quite a valid concern that you know, those workers and those people representing them would have. But there is enormous support from the ETU for this change, state and federal. The ETU is behind the move to renewables. It's opposing vanity, wasteful, environmentally damaging projects like the Kurri Kurri gas plant that the Morrison government wants to build, using taxpayers' money to build it'll be between 700 million and $1 billion white elephant that will be used about 2% of the time, if that. But the ETU has come out and shown real leadership in opposing that and saying that they want their members to be getting those jobs that are available in this expanded renewable energy zone. And the MUA, the Maritime Union of Australia, has been at the forefront of pushing for the expansion of the offshore wind industry now for the better part of a decade. And I really do credit the work that the MUA has done in establishing a credible baseline for regulation in that industry. So there's a lot of union support within the blue-collar workforce for this kind of transition. And these are people we obviously, all politicians should be working closely with.
Okay. The next comment is from Vivian Pausot. This is very positive news, David. Would there be any possibility of the Greens approaching the ACTU for a climate justice accord, incorporating these positive models? That's another.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But one of the ways we got those 2 new renewable energy zones in the New South Wales roadmap, the one in the Illawarra and the one in the Hunter Central Coast, was by sitting down and working with the union movement, and the Hunter unions were really important in pushing theirs. And I do want to give a shout out to Arthur Roris and the South Coast Labor Council for the work they did in pushing to get the renewable energy zone in the Illawarra legislated. Because again, that work hasn't come out of nowhere. That's work that the South Coast Labor Council has been doing, talking about green jobs, talking about the potential for renewable energy to feed in and expand the Illawarra manufacturing sector. That's work they've been doing for the better part of 2 decades. And you can see that long-term committed principled work from people like South Coast Labor Council, Arthur Roris, other players, actually is now beginning to get returns.
Okay, there's another question from Jackie Marks. Is there still resistance in the union leadership for renewables, recognising the problem of transition is the main concern for miners and they need leadership?
Well, I think I've kind of addressed that in part today, and I would think it'd be wrong to say that there's resistance in union leadership. The bulk of the union leadership that I know is super on board the renewables project. They see that's where the future jobs are. They see that's where job security is. We all live on the same bloody planet. And we want to make sure that we're not going to, send it to hell in a handbasket. So the union leadership broadly is 100% behind the transition to renewables, and ensuring it's done in a way, as I said before, where people aren't left behind. Indeed, where if we do it right, we provide this huge surge of, at different times, free electricity. Let's be clear. One of the reasons why some of the corporate donors behind the Liberal Party and the National Party and the corporate donors to Labor don't like this change is because the scale of the renewable energy that's going to be pumped in when these projects are done means there'll be substantial parts of the time where the actual price of energy will be next to zero. There'll be so much of it being pumped in the market. People will be wanting you to suck it down and use it in your home. For some people who are so hell-bent on this kind of super profit model of energy and constantly sucking money out of households for energy, the idea that when we get this right, we build the kind of scale that the Greens are calling for, there will be substantial parts of the year where there will be close to free electricity being delivered to your home. You'll just be paying the sort of, the access fee. That frightens a bunch of big corporate players. It frightens a bunch of the donors to the Liberal Party and the National Party and even some of the Labor Party donors. But I've got to tell you, it excites me, and it should excite most people when they're thinking about what their future energy bills will be.
Okay, now the next question's going to sort of the counter model. Prue Cansian wants to know, what do you see as the likelihood of the Narrabri gas and the Hunter pipeline proceeding?
Well, that is why we are seeing this appallingly damaging project with the Kurri Kurri gas project. These are all fundamentally linked. The Kurri Kurri gas generator will be the kind of underpinning market demand that will justify both the pipeline and the initial investment in the Narrabri coal seam gas project. So they're all fundamentally linked. And so that is why the next federal election is going to be so important. We need a majority, a non-coalition majority in both houses of parliament to immediately scrap the Kurri Kurri gas project, because when that falls over, a lot of the economic underpinning for the pipeline falls over, and a lot of the economic underpinning for the Narrabri CSG project falls over. That's really what's at stake here. It's not just the Kurri Kurri gas project, shamefully wasteful, environmentally damaging, economically reckless as it is. It's that entire industrialisation of that part of the state from there leading north that's at stake. One of the reasons I am deeply committed to ensuring, for one of many, I might add, to get rid of this coalition government, because that'll be a critical win in that those three projects.
Okay, and I could ask you a question myself about the underneath or the underpinnings of the renewable energy zones. Is there a sort of actual institutionalising of community, trade union and other stakeholder voices there? Or is it still a fairly free for all for business?
Well, there is in both the Hunter and the Illawarra. There are boards in each of those which have guaranteed representation by unions in those boards, and are designed to sort of be mapping forward the projects, both the industrial projects that come downstream from the expansion of the renewable energy zone, but also the renewable energy zones themselves. In the other parts of the state, there isn't that kind of guaranteed legislative community/union engagement, but which is one of the reasons why we have been working so intensely on things like the guidelines that are going to underpin how First Nations communities are consulted and negotiated, and to ensure that they're at the table when projects are being proposed, when they're being designed, when they're being built, and they're there for the life of the project, getting a fair income stream from the project. But there are definitely challenges in this space. And regional communities are right to be stepping forward, and a bunch of regional mayors are stepping forward and saying they don't want to see a repeat of the mistakes that have happened in some of those projects in South Australia. They don't want to have a sugar hit of 6 to 12 months of jobs for a construction and then see nothing afterwards in their communities. And that should be on all of our agendas and all of our radars. Right.
Okay. One other angle is, and this is a sort of hilarious thought, we've got the COP26 coming, and we've got a very difficult scenario with the Morrison government's delegation. Does the New South Wales government itself have any sort of role there at all? Are they going to take states with them to Glasgow, or is this the alternative?
I think the federal energy minister would do everything he could. He would insist upon a national health order to prevent the New South Wales minister from leaving the country to go over there, I think. So no, unfortunately not. But look, in the absence of federal leadership, it's going to be states that are going to need to step up, and that we've done that to an extent in New South Wales. Not as far as I'd like to go. There are still major problems with what's happening in New South Wales. It's the same government that's building this renewable energy roadmap that's also approving endless bloody new expansions of coal mines. Yeah. It's the same. It's still Matt Kean's office that has refused to scrub the regulation that is going to allow for a biomass power generator in Redbank, just north of Newcastle. And biomass is deeply, deeply environmentally damaging. So I'm not pretending it's perfect at a state level, but it's a hell of a lot better, and it's actually got a plan for the future, unlike the federal. But I would love there to be state representation at COP, but unfortunately not feasible.
Okay, and last,
it's another reason.
Yeah.
Another reason to change the federal government. We can't keep sending these people as our representatives to international gatherings. It's not only embarrassing, it's like damaging for the planet.
Yeah, I totally agree there. I was going to just have one more question about the impact of the school strike for climate and the grassroots agitation for much more decisive action. It's coming up, and unfortunately we have a lockdown in New South Wales. So I don't know whether we'll still be in October 15, but it looks like it. So have the school strikers had any interaction with this debate?
Well, I think that the mindset that those school strikes have produced has actually been really important. I don't think we would have got where we are in New South Wales. I don't think the debate could have been won in the time that it had, either in the coalition party room or in the New South Wales Parliament more broadly, without the political space created by some of those extremely important climate demonstrations, climate marches, and hearing from the next generation who are saying, you're fucking up the planet. Sorry, Peter. You're stuffing up the planet. It's on your watch, but we're going to inherit it and we demand better. We demand a place at the table. That has created the envelope, if you like, in which a lot of this negotiation is happening. And that continuing agitation will be essential for the envelope and the environment when we finally throw the Morrison government out and we produce that national roadmap as well. So I think it's critically important. And I hope everybody will do everything they can to support the student climate strike on the 15th.
Okay, well, thanks very much, David. I think that's the end of the questions and comments. So onward to the national plan. Thank you very much on behalf of all of the listeners, and thank you for all the questions and comments that did come through. I'd like to just announce what's happening 2 weeks from now. So that's the normal Tuesday event for Sydney Politics in the Pub. This one is focusing on the Julian Assange situation. The title of the event is Julian Assange, What's the Appeal? Because an appeal by the US authorities in the British court system is about to take place. And, you know, it's a lot, as we all know, a very great deal at stake in this. The speakers are going to be Professor Bill Hogan, Lissa Johnson, John Shipton, who is Julian's father, Mary Kostakidis, who's well known, and Julian Hill, a Labor federal member of Parliament from Victoria. This will be at 6 o'clock sharp on Tuesday, October 5, online, as we expect with the public health orders. And it's being sponsored by Consortium News, as well as Sydney Politics in the Pub, and it'll be streamed on 2 channels. So please join the Politics in the Pub Facebook group to get the notifications of events. And the videos of our events are on our pages, website pages of Sydney Politics in the Pub, just politicsinthepub.org.au. Okay,
can I just
go ahead, Kathy.
Yep. As your Miss Digital producer, working at Consortium News, I have to correct you there. We're simulcasting it. We're not sponsoring it. But yeah, I just wanted to say that the title next week has 2 meanings. So what's the appeal, Julian Assange, what's the appeal? What is the appeal with this case? Why is it so special? And, you know, what's at stake here as well. So why it matters. I think that that's another interpretation that you can put on this title. I left it open so that speakers could interpret it as they would like, or what both ways.
Rightio. Thanks, Kathy. I mean, Kathy's the one who organised that panel, and you know, you can see how high-powered it is. And again, I think it's one of those things, especially for Australians, to try to strike out for justice in this situation.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, David. Thank you, Kathy. Thanks you to the audience.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, everyone, for the questions.